20 years ago, Howard Butt Jr. hired me to be on his writing team. We had lots of fun for a few years, writing books together and writing radio spots for the high calling. Mr. Butt, we always called him Mr. Butt, was 78 years old when I started working with him. I remember presenting a project to him at his house when he was 85. Can you imagine that? In America, we often talk about time like it's working against us. Where did the years go? I'm not as young as I used to be. But time is doing more than slipping away and making us older. Aging is natural. When we age well, we call that maturity. So how do we age well? How do we flourish in our 60s and beyond? Maybe there are specific practices we can start in our 20s and 30s to help us age well. And I'm not just talking about investing in like the stock market or money for retirement. I wonder, what does it look like to invest in ourselves? Today, we're talking about planning for our future and our legacy and flourishing no matter our age. I'm Marcus Goodyear from the H.E. Butt Foundation, and this is the Echoes Podcast. Our guest today is Mark D. Roberts, a senior fellow from the Max De Pree Center for Leadership at Fuller Seminary. And full disclosure, Mark used to be my boss, and he was a great boss. Mark has written numerous books, including Can We Trust the Gospels and an incredible commentary on the book of Ephesians. Mark also co-hosted his own podcast for many years called Making It Work. I have a co-host too. Ladies and gentlemen, Camille Hall Ortega, my friend and colleague.
Hi, Marcus. Good to be here.
Mark Roberts, welcome to the Echoes Podcast.
Thanks. It's a blast to be with you folks.
You were the director of Laity Lodge for many years, and you've told a story about Laity Lodge that I want to start with. You were at a retreat, and you overheard Betty Ann Cody say, "I love being old." Can you tell us about that moment?
Sure. Betty Ann Cody, for those who don't know, was the wife of a former director of Laity Lodge. And so she was leading a devotion one morning. So it's kind of early, and that's her first line. "I love being old." And, you know, I'm still kind of sleepy. I'm like, what? Did I hear that right? Because honestly, I don't think I'd ever heard anybody say that in my whole life. And she sort of knew that was a bit of a surprise. So she said, "No, let me say that again. I love being old." And then she went on in her devotion to talk about why she loved being old. And her devotion was about wisdom and how God gives us wisdom as we age. But I just was so struck by the fact that here is somebody who is not ashamed of being old. For one thing, she called herself old. She was 80 in her 80s. So, you know, I guess that's old. But a lot of times people don't want to acknowledge that. And it really shook me up. And I always remembered it. I mean, that's partly why I talk about it, because it was like, wow, wouldn't that be something if when I was her age, if I got that far, I could say that. I love being old. I love what I've learned in life and the richer life that I live now and the wisdom God has given me and the opportunity to use that wisdom to serve others. And it was just it was a surprise, and it's a great encouragement. It's really inspired a lot of my life and work since then.
Wow. I can imagine what an impactful time that would have been. I know that we're making reference to the third, and I just want to right up front have you kind of define what we mean by that.
Yeah, we talk at the De Pree Center at Fuller, and I talk about the third of life, which we use that language because people kind of get it. I mean, there's probably anybody listening that kind of gets it, and so that's part of it. But to talk about the third doesn't assume a particular story of life. So, for example, a lot of folks would say, well, you're talking about retirement. Well, yes, for those who experience retirement, but many don't, or the retirement story can be a very diverse one. Sometimes people will talk about encore or something. There's certain language we avoid, right? We people in my age bracket really don't like to be called elderly, or, you know, there are other things worse. So third is neutral. If you actually wanted to know, well, when does it actually start? If you look at current statistics in the United States, the third of life starts at 52 years and 9 months. It went down when in COVID, the age expectancy went down. Yeah. But really what we're talking about is serving folk generally in their late 50s on. And sometimes that's a long on too.
So we have the Echoes magazine, the median age is 51. So in one sense, this conversation is right at our target. We have a second group of readers who are in their 20s. So the median age of 51, they're going to pick up this conversation no problem. Why would those 20-year-olds be interested in this? How is it relevant to them?
Yeah, great question. I love it. So, for a number of reasons, I mean, one and the most obvious would be many of those 20-year-olds are going to have parents and or grandparents in the
Yeah.
third of life, people they really love and care about. And learning about how those folks can flourish and how one can live a healthy and good life, that's going to matter. But here's the other thing. So much of what we've discovered about what helps us flourish in the third of life are things that if we began them earlier, it would have made a huge difference. Now, the most obvious, people would think, oh, yeah, kind of like health. Yeah, kind of like health. You know, if you eat well and get exercise when you're younger, odds are you're going to be healthier when you're older. But as it turns out, there actually are other sort of basic practices and disciplines of life that if we start early, we will, in all likelihood, have a longer and a better life. And I'll give just the most amazing example. So there is this study it used to be called the Grant Study. Now it's the Harvard Study of Adult Development. And they have studied people. They started in the late 1930s, and followed people for a lifetime, basically asking the question, what enables people to live well? And they did surveys and medical tests and followed these people throughout their lives. I think all of them are now dead, actually, because that was a long time ago. And he says, what did we find helps us live best and live longer and better? And he said, it's not working harder. It's not making more money. It's not even having better cholesterol and that sort of thing. The most
Thank goodness.
Yes, the most important contributor to living well at age 80 is the quality of our relationships at age 50 and younger.
Wow.
Now yes, wow. And folk in their 20s, folk in their teens for that matter. I mean, if we really believe that, wait, the quality of my relationships is going to be the most important contributor to my living long and living well in all seasons of life, well, then I think I want to start investing in and building really good and healthy relationships and communities.
I love this. I told my mom, I have two young kids. So I have a 6-year-old little boy and I have a 3.5-year-old little girl. And my mom watches my kids when they're not in school. I tell my parents, you're welcome, because I'm seeing studies come out that say this is making you happier and this is going to make you live longer. And even similarly, I've seen things where they're telling older folks, having a dog that you have a relationship with is going to make you live a longer, healthier life. And so I'm imagining that people are picking up on these things. Are you seeing some of that in your work?
Oh, absolutely. And people resonate with it. But it's a real problem. So a few years back, the Surgeon General came out with this major report on loneliness and isolation in the United States. And what a huge problem it is, especially for older adults. And again, you think, well, why would that be? Well, many older adults say lose a spouse. So all of a sudden they're living alone, or they're, and the cost of loneliness and isolation to our physical health, not to mention just, our mental health and well-being, our physical health is huge. So the Surgeon General says, experiencing pretty extreme loneliness and isolation, the way millions and millions of Americans do, is for your health the equivalent to smoking 15 cigarettes a day.
So, Mark, I have a practical question for you. First of all, I should confess that I just turned 51, so I'm very close to entering the third.
You are.
This is all super top of mind for me, and I did a couple of things when I was 50 to sort of prove to myself that that I was aging well. Although I do find that language creeping in, thinking about that I'm aging, that I feel a little older for probably the first time in my life. Actually, certain things that used to be very easy are just a little bit harder. But my kids don't live where I live. So I don't have a situation like Camille where if I want to be around my grandkids, they're just going to be here, which means my wife and I are facing the question of moving. And I know that you moved. in your third, I think
Mm-hmm.
twice, because you were probably 50 when you came to Lady Lodge.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
And I'm curious, moving essentially cuts off some of those relationships. You have to
Yeah.
start them over. How
Yeah.
do you do that well? Especially given that so many older adults retire and then move somewhere and sever their relationships.
Great question, and the way you're framing it is great. And I mean, part of the answer to your question is, well, there's no one answer to that. People are
Okay.
different and will make different choices. But what you're pointing out, here's what happens not infrequently. People leave, their colder city they've lived in or town they've lived in for, 30,
Fair.
40 years. They move to some place that's warm. It's great, the warmth and the activities and all that sort of thing, but they have lost all of their core and key relationships, and that really costs them, and they feel it. And some people move home even to the
Mm.
cold. Now, some who are able will split their year, between warm and cold and that sort of thing. But the point is, there is a significant cost to moving from your cold place where you've lived your whole life to a warm place. Now, there may be advantages too. Okay, that's one thing. Here's another thing that sometimes happens. So parents, grandparents will again move away from everything they've known, their church, their friends, their activities, their jobs, and they'll move to be close to the grandchildren. And sometimes that's great. And sometimes it's not so good. That's too much relationship, and they're totally cut off. And then sometimes the children and grandchildren get a job switch and they move. So now all of a sudden, you've moved from all of your core relationships throughout your whole life, and now you're living all by yourself in a brand new place, and you don't know anybody. As we think about where we're going to live in the latter seasons of life, there are so many questions. Most Americans want to live in their home. They want to stay where they are.
Yeah.
There are some real benefits to that, but sometimes that contributes to the loneliness and isolation. Sometimes
That's
our
true.
homes are not very well suited for us when we're older. Maybe they're not equipped. And so again, lots of issues. It's partly the work we're doing is to help people think about these things in a way that perhaps they haven't thought about before.
Really interesting. We have on previous episodes discussed the importance of community and different ways to kind of achieve community in your life, have community in your life. How have you seen spiritual life, faith, church come into play, especially for folks in their third?
I'm impressed at churches that are working on helping multi-generational relationships happen. And I think, for
Yes.
example, of Highland Park Presbyterian Church down in Dallas. I have many friends there and know them well. And they have done a lot of different things to try and help folk who are older be with folk who are younger. But you don't exactly walk up to a stranger on Sunday morning and say, "Hey, young person, do you want to hang out?"
Yes.
And so I think churches can provide the context in which this can happen. But
Right.
then what needs to happen, there are different ways to help facilitate this and advance it.
And Mark, you've also talked in your third materials about looking for new narratives of aging. We've talked about a few of those, and that's in contrast to what you have understood to be damaging narratives about aging, damaging cultural messages.
Yeah.
So I'm curious, I'd love to hear you talk a little bit about some of the, at the risk of being negative, some of the more damaging things people in our culture believe about aging, and how you respond to that and how you find alternatives.
Well, ironically, the first negative narrative I would mention is the one that a lot of folks think is the great narrative. And that is sort of, you retire and now it's all for you. It's all about you. And you'll find this. You'll find this language in promoting of senior adult communities and other things. It's like, you've worked hard, you gave, you raised your children. It was all for others. Now it's all for you.
It's your time.
And I mean, often people are living into that narrative, maybe at 60 years old. They might have 25, 30, or even more years of life left. And all of a sudden, it's all for you. So that can at first feel like, wow, this is a real positive narrative. I get to just live for myself. But I mean, from a Christian point of view, we'd say, well, that's not quite what God has called us to.
Right.
But there's also a lot of research that says people who just live for themselves often do not flourish because there is something in us. I mean, we were created and called to be people who serve and care for others. And the older adults who really do well are not just living for themselves, but they've found ways to live for others. The second big narrative is you really have outlived your usefulness and your fruitfulness. It's like you've, and you hear this, you'll hear this a lot, often in association with whoever happens to be president. Now that we've had older folk on, both parties, it isn't even a partisan thing anymore, but it's like, oh, you've had your chance. You don't have much to contribute anymore. And that's a very common negative narrative. The one that's associated with that is, and you're basically going to drag down our whole society and economy. You're not contributing. You sometimes hear the language. It's very common. They'll talk about the growth of older adults, the number of older adults as a silver tsunami. In other words,
Wow.
silver as in silver hair,
Sure.
like mine.
Right.
Tsunami as in this large thing that's going to wipe us out. And so there are all these narratives, either the one that says, hey, it's all for you, or the one that says, and by the way, you really don't have anything much to contribute anyway. And as a matter of fact, you and all your people are going to really hurt us and even potentially wipe us out. And the problem is that a lot of older people, it's not only that younger people might think that, and that's not a good thing, but many who are older actually internalize that. And then when you think about it, it begins to make a little sense because you think, well, if I just think, getting old is terrible and I'm going to be sick and it's going to be awful, maybe I won't go to the doctor, or I'm old. I can't contribute anymore. I got nothing to give. So I don't give. And the things that help us to live well and live longer, I stopped doing because I'm old. And anyway, stunning. But the challenge then for all of us, and again, this starts when you're younger. How do you think about being older? Can we reframe this in a way that is both more truthful, but also is going to be more healthful? Marcus, how old were you when you were hired at Laity Lodge? Or in
I was
foundation?
31. Yeah,
Okay.
30,
Wow.
So you're this 31-year-old person working with what, 78-year-old Howard Butt?
Yeah.
Okay. If you had any sort of prejudice about older people not being creative, not having vision, not having energy, not having mission, I mean, because you had that relationship, you would say, oh, that's not it. In fact, you were experiencing someone who was old, living with tremendous vitality and contribution. And, that sort of thing that can really change the way we think about aging in general and the way we envision our own lives.
That's huge, Mark. And it's perfect because we're very curious about what it looks like to relate well across generations.
Yes.
And so for us, so for me, I'm a millennial and Marcus is Gen X. And of course, my parents are boomers. And so what we see quite often is that although perhaps in faith communities, there is, of course, this knowledge that we're meant to be treating the elderly with respect for their wisdom and thus and such, there's often sort of a little bit of an eye roll of like, those guys can't get it. These guys from this generation, they just don't get it. And even that goes the opposite direction too, where kind of all of us can be looking at Gen Alpha and Gen Z going, oh my goodness, please, enough with all of whatever you're doing. What do you see as sort of important practical steps for treating each other with respect among the generations?
No, I love that question. And, so I'm a boomer. So, there's okay boomer.
Yeah.
And I kind of
not so
get
much
that.
anymore. You don't hear it as often.
No, you don't as much. But it's such a great question because one of the things that used to be true in our world, but in our country, was that there was a fair amount of intergenerational relationship. People lived in smaller towns, families lived together.
Right.
Increasingly, that is less true. And part of what that means is a lot of times we don't know people outside of our own cohort, our own people, the folk we hang out with. And when you don't know people, it's really easy to stereotype or to have prejudice,
Mm.
or you
Yeah.
see the extremes. And of course, you know, the media and especially social media are going to point out the extremes of whatever it is. And so, you know, it would be easy for a person of my age to look down on, you know, a Gen Xer or a millennial and say, look at those, they don't want to work and they're lazy. They're only thinking about their own well-being. They're on their phones all the time, et cetera, right? But when you really get to know somebody, that those kinds of stereotypes turn out not to be accurate. And one of the things we desperately need in our world and in the church, I think the church can be a great place for this, is to actually get to know people who are not like I am. And by the way, we could obviously be having this conversation about other things, about race and
Sure.
other ways
Yeah.
where,
Yeah.
because when you really, and some of us have been greatly blessed to have those kinds of intergenerational relationships. So in my case, I mean, when I started working with Howard Butt and knowing him, I mean, I was 50, so I was older, but I grew up very close to my mom's father, my grandfather. I would say he was
Mm.
really my best friend in life. And
Oh.
I didn't think of it at the time, but that was profoundly shaping my view of what it
Mm.
is to be older.
I love the notion of it being reciprocal because we're seeing that in studies as well, that
Yes.
it's not one sided, that these intergenerational relationships really are beneficial for both sides, whether it's mentor, whether it's actual familial relationships, whether it's seeking community in your church. I think about a story that something you said sparked is that when my parents first got married, my dad's mother, less than a year into their marriage, my dad's mother was tragically killed in a
Mm,
car accident.
Oh
And
no.
so for us growing up, we didn't have that relationship. My other grandmother lived in Memphis, Tennessee, and we're in Texas, so we didn't have that. And so my dad's best friend, his mother called my
mm,
dad in and she said, "You're my son now." She said,
mm,
"My kids are your brothers and your
mm.
sisters, and your kids can call me grandma." In the communication and psychology research, they sometimes call this fictive kin. But so
Yeah,
we grew up with these important fictive kin relationships where intergenerational, where we were able to call my dad's best friend's
yeah,
mother granny and call her
yeah.
kids uncle and aunt. And just because they weren't actual familial relationships, they were deeply formative for us.
I love that. That's great.
Yeah, I have the same story, Camille. My mom was adopted, and the only grandparents I ever really knew were her foster parents. She wasn't adopted; she was
Mm,
Mm,
fostered,
mm,
and I called them grandpa. I called them grandma. My
mm.
grandma's still alive. Yeah, so I've never thought of calling that a fictive relationship. That's really interesting. All of this talk about generational healing and the institution of the church and the institution of towns, it reminds me of Howard Butt Jr., who we've been talking about a lot. He's been
Mm.
behind a lot of this conversation, much more so than our normal podcast episodes.
yeah.
I think partially, Mark, because you came on and we both worked for him. But we have a clip. This is from 2009. He was 81 when he gave this clip. He was at Laity Lodge, and this is, I think, the last time he spoke at Laity Lodge, and this is
Mm,
actually the end of the talk. So
mm,
he's giving this talk. He's talking about generational healing and its connection to institutional healing at Laity Lodge. And at the end, he segues into a poem. And basically the very last thing he ever said at Laity Lodge officially is this, to quote this poem by
mm,
Christina Rossetti. So you'll hear his voice change a bit as he starts reciting the poem. But I'd love to play this for you, Mark, and just
mm.
get your take.
Our greatest earthly need is generational healing. Well, why do I say that generational healing is crucial? Generational healing offers us institutional peace. We must aspire to relationships of love with our parents and our children. I am an unapologetic institutionalist. I believe in institutions. I'm sure that's part of the reason I spent my life in two institutions, the H.E. Butt Grocery Company, the H.E. Butt Foundation. Anyone who wants to think institutionally is going to go against the culture of our society. Does the road wind uphill all the way? Yes, to the very end. Will the day's journey take the whole long day from morn to night, my friend?
Love to get your thoughts on that clip, Mark.
I'm honestly a little choked up
Mm.
because Howard meant the world to me. He was about the age of my dad, and my dad died at a fairly young age. And so along the way, the Lord put men in my life who were like a father, and he was very much like a father to me. And he was also one from whom I learned so much about all kinds of things. And it was so interesting. I mean, here he is. So Marcus said he's what, 81?
Yeah.
When he started out, and his initial sort of influence was not talking about institutions and intergenerational healing. He was about the ministry of the laity. Well, we had Laity Lodge. He was about faith work and the integration of faith work, the high calling of your daily work. And he never lost those deep commitments. But he was the kind of person who was just living and learning and new things. And so by the end of his life, there are all these new things that he cares about, is speaking about, learning about, growing about. And I mean, and one of them being the intergenerational healing and recognizing that for there to be the quality of relationships that we seek in family and in other institutions, right? He said that yes, we need to understand each other and we need to discover who we are, but there's healing that needs to happen. Howard was pretty open about some of the challenges he experienced from his own father and needing to come to a place of forgiveness and acceptance. Families are the greatest, and it's also where we do some of the greatest harm to each other.
Yeah.
And so this notion of intergenerational healing, but also his concern for institutions. I mean, his language about that came rather late. And I just think here's a man who in his late 70s and early 80s is, as I said, learning, growing, thinking creatively, trying new ideas, giving of himself to others, people like me and others whom he mentored. What a gift.
Marcus, I'm really curious your thoughts on this audio as well, especially just because it's Howard and his last talk at Laity Lodge. And
Yeah. Well, I mean, like Mark, I get a little choked up. He was incredibly influential in my life, and in a lot of ways, he really helped me break away from some dysfunctional things in my life that I just didn't even realize were problems. And he was so gentle about it and so caring. And I was I was a little bit of a handful in my 30s, and he never got rid of me. I'm still here. So that's part of what's underneath all of that as I'm listening. The ideas of institutional renewal come from several different places, but he was especially fixated on a thinker named Hugh Heclo at the end. And I think that's what he was actually referencing in that talk. And just this idea that in order for society to flourish, we need to believe in each other and we need to trust each other. And Howard would talk about institutions like they were individuals. And so the same kinds of language he would apply to individual renewal and kind of relationships between two people, he would think about the relationships between two institutions, or the relationship between the person in the institution and the institution itself. Like my relationship to the foundation, or my relationship to Kerrville, or Kerrville's relationship to the foundation. And he was really a genius. And I wouldn't have had access to any of that if I hadn't been able to work with him.
You know, Marcus, you mentioned Thinking Institutionally. That was Hugh Heclo's book, which Howard read, and it was very influential for him. So here's the way Howard approached things. He read the book, we worked on the ideas, but then the relational part of him says to me, well, you have to go meet him. And I'm like, well, no, he's a professor. No, you have to meet him. And so I and one other organization reached out, and he was, in fact, glad to meet with us. And we met with him in his home, and he was a delightful man. Turned out he's also a person of faith, and there was this sweet thing. So it's institutional in the broader sense, and it was deeply, profoundly relational in a very personal sense, and everything in between. That's pretty amazing.
But I love that because that's just highlighting how Howard knew the importance of relationship. That it just harkens back to what you were speaking about before, Mark, that there is, of course, sometimes difficulty when we go, oh, this person really doesn't get it, or they're so much older, or they're so much younger. But when we take the time to be intentional about getting to know others, it is so often hugely impactful and fruitful. And so I just love that notion.
Hmm.
It's good.
Mark, are you ready to say you love being old?
Oh,
It's so interesting because I think about that. I can't say it as unapologetically as Betty did. And she owned in her talk, there's some hard things about being old. And I'm still, the physical things come up that you didn't have when you were younger. It's harder to sleep often when you get older. These things like, oh man. And that's why a lot of people will say, getting old isn't easier. It's a drag being old. People will complain about it.
sure.
The thing that Betty first alerted me to, and now I am much more attentive to, is some of the amazing gifts of being older. When I turned 65, I had a very unexpected, it was my birthday, get up in the morning, and I found myself, I was really down. I was thinking like, most of my life is over. And I wasn't expecting this. I'm not usually that kind of person. And I was really like, oh man. So I went down and I sat down to do my devotions. And it was one of those times in life where it was like God really spoke to me. And what God said to me is read Psalm 103. Like, well, some of you would know Psalm 103 is this amazing sort of chronicle of the wonderful ways that God has blessed and ministered to the psalmist. And so I start out reading it, and it's bless the Lord, oh my soul, all that in me, bless his holy name, don't forget all his benefits, who forgives all your iniquity. I started thinking of the ways God has forgiven me when I really messed up, who heals all your diseases. I almost died of a Rocky Mountain spotted fever, and the Lord healed me. Who redeems your life from the pit, and on and on. And as I started reflecting on this, I mean, literally, I was just weeping with gratitude for how rich my life was and how much God had blessed me.
To be fair, I don't think I don't know if you fully qualify as old yet, but
I'm 68.
I'm just throwing the question back at you.
I'm 68 and I have all white hair. So that's...
I think, 75, I think, is like the beginning of old, maybe.
It's so funny because when you ask people, generally, there are all these surveys. Younger people tend to think old is like 55 and 60.
Oh,
by the time you're in your 70s, you ask people in their 70s, well, what is old? It'll be like 85 and 90.
Yeah.
We're always putting it off.
Push it back a little.
But
I just want to make sure I don't think you're old. But
but I want to get to the point, and I think we would want to get to the point in our culture and in our world where it wouldn't even be thought of as a bad thing to be old.
Right.
I mean, that was part of the thing about Betty. I love being old. She wasn't embarrassed. I'm old.
Yeah.
And I think many of us can think, well, it isn't good to be old, and I'm thinking, well, wouldn't it be great if we could say, yeah, it is great to be old, partly because the only alternative is, well, you didn't live that long, right?
Right.
And come to cherish and be grateful for the gifts that go with being older. And that's what I'm trying to live into. And sometimes I can, and sometimes not as much.
Oh, I love it. I love it. I think that's a great place to end.
Yes.
Mark, thank you so much for being with us. This is the Echoes Podcast. It's written and produced by Camille Hull Ortega, Rob Stinnett, and me, Marcus Goodyear. It's edited by Rob Stinnett and Kim Stone. Our executive producers are David Rogers and Patton Dodd. Special thanks to our guest today, Mark D. Roberts. Mark, do you get Echoes Magazine?
I do get Echoes Magazine. I always read Echoes Magazine.
That is fantastic. And if you're listening to this podcast, you should get it too because it's free. Go to echoesmagazine.org to subscribe.
Can I just say, because it has really great stories in it.
Yes.
Even if you don't know anything about the foundation, it's where any of that. The stories are really very engaging and moving and wonderful. So get it because it's free and there's some great stories.
That's right. You can find a link in our show notes. Thank you, Mark. The Echoes Podcast and Echoes Magazine are both productions of the H.E. Butt Foundation. You can learn more about our vision and mission at hebfdn.org.